The Vikings, from pagans to Christians. While Charlemagne converted pagans to Christianity by the sword, the Vikings' conversion happened mostly without violence. In the early Viking Age, Norse traders realized they were at a disadvantage in deals with Christian merchants. Christian traders often favored fellow Christians, offering them better opportunities while discriminating against pagans and Muslims. A Viking merchant might wear a cross when among Christians, only to swap it for Thor's hammer upon returning home. As long as a Viking hadn't been baptized, he could follow both faiths, a common practice in Scandinavia for centuries. At first, the Norse Vikings were not Christian. They cherished their own gods and were content with them. Christian priests and monks from England and the Frankish lands began missionary efforts in Scandinavia as early as the 700s and 800s. Still, the conversion of the Vikings unfolded gradually over many centuries. Even when a Danish or Swedish king accepted Christianity and declared his people Christian, many still held onto old rituals and continued honoring their traditional gods. By the end of the Viking Age, however, most Vikings had fully embraced Christianity, having been baptized and buried in accordance with the new faith. The Vikings, from pagans to Christians. Denmark, while an earlier Danish Viking king, Harald Klak, had been baptized in 826. It wasn't until King Harald Bluetooth's baptism in 965 that Christianity truly took root in Denmark. Harald Bluetooth erected the famous Jelling Stone, proclaiming that he had made all the Danes Christian, though in reality, the new faith coexisted alongside the old beliefs for several centuries. Over time, the Danish Vikings gradually embraced Christianity. By 1110, construction had begun on the first stone church in Denmark's oldest town, Ribe. It was completed in 1134. By then, most of the Danish people had become Christian. The Viking Age 793-1066 began with brutal raids on monasteries, yet ended with Viking kings standing as defenders of Christianity. This transformation is striking, since for centuries the clash between Vikings and the rest of Europe was often portrayed as a struggle between paganism and Christendom. But how deep was this change, really? And what drove it to happen? In this video, we'll explore the complex relationship between the Vikings and Christianity and the lasting influence they had on each other. The early Norse lived within a worldview that permeated every part of their daily lives. Their faith in the gods was so natural, so ingrained, that their language didn't even have a word for religion. Rituals and ceremonies were usually led by local chieftains, not by a structured priesthood. Shamans, seers, and spiritual specialists did exist, but they were rare exceptions rather than the backbone of the faith. Grand pagan temples like the famous one at Uppsala in Sweden, described by Adam of Bremen, were destinations for special occasions. Yet for most people, worship happened outdoors, in sacred groves, on hills, or in other natural spaces. Because their faith lacked hierarchy and formal organization, the Norse often struggled to understand religions like Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, with their rules, clergy, and concepts of sin and salvation. Unlike these faiths, the Vikings never sought to convert others. At times, they repurposed Christian sites as pagan shrines, but usually as part of a military strategy. Some captives or subjects under Viking control may have adopted Norse beliefs, but most did not. As for the brutal treatment of Christian priests, monks, and nuns, much of it was either a tactic of terror in warfare or simply the cruelty of individual raiders. To the people of early medieval Europe, monasteries and abbeys were far more than houses of prayer. They were centers of knowledge, music, and culture. Kings and nobles poured wealth into them to display their piety and power. Yet despite their treasures, monasteries were poorly defended, making them prime targets for Viking raids. Even pagan sanctuaries were not safe. In the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok and his sons, Ivar and his brothers sack a pagan shrine simply to gain riches and fame. By the 10th and 11th centuries, even Christian Vikings still sometimes attacked monasteries, and Christian kings who were not Norse plundered churches sponsored by Viking rulers. In this violent age, Religious centers, whether pagan or Christian, were increasingly viewed as vulnerable assets of a rival, rather than untouchable houses of God. Looking closely at the sources, it becomes clear, for most Vikings, the repeated assaults on sacred places were never about spreading their beliefs or destroying another faith. In the end, it all came down to wealth and plunder. Christian reactions to Viking raids. Much of what we know about the Viking invasions comes from non-Norse sources, most of them written by monks or clerics. These writers naturally framed the events through a religious lens, while the Norse believed that fate ruled over everything. Medieval Christians held that God controlled all. So when Viking raiders stormed across Europe and desecrated churches seemingly without consequence, it struck a devastating spiritual blow. Many concluded that the Vikings were not just invaders, but instruments of divine punishment for sins yet to be revealed. This mindset, however, offered little practical help on the battlefield. Each Viking victory chipped away at morale. Instead of analyzing mistakes and adapting to meet the northern warriors head-on, many leaders doubled down on prayer and penitence, only to sink deeper into despair when defeat followed yet again. For years, this gave the Vikings a powerful psychological advantage. It was not until Christian forces finally scored some meaningful victories, nearly a generation later, that they regained confidence and began finding real solutions to the Viking problem. Early missionaries in Scandinavia began in the 9th century. Carolingian rulers dispatched missionaries to Scandinavia, particularly to Denmark, in hopes of spreading Christianity. Despite the Vikings' fearsome reputation, these envoys were often received without violence. Still, the challenge was immense. Old Norse, though part of the broader Germanic language family, had evolved so much that mastering it was no easy feat. Missionaries struggled to achieve the level of eloquence and poetic expression that the Vikings admired. In the end, it was not these early preachers who won Scandinavia over to Christianity, it was the Vikings themselves who gradually chose to adopt the new faith, changing Norse views of Christianity over time. The fierce contempt that early Vikings held for Christianity began to soften. Part of the reason was simple. Christians started winning battles. Leaders such as Alfred the Great in England, King Constantine in Scotland, and Mael Secnaill in Ireland developed strategies that broke the aura of Viking invincibility. At the same time, frustrated by their rulers' failure to protect them, some church leaders took up arms themselves. Bishops and abbots of noble birth, already trained in warfare, sometimes proved to be skilled and inspiring commanders. Monasteries fortified their defenses like the Round Tower at Glendalough in Ireland, and men such as Bishop Hemond of Wessex fought and died with sword in hand. To Viking eyes, this revealed a new side of the Christian God, a warrior God they could understand and even respect. Yet, this militarization of the church would leave deep and lasting consequences for medieval Europe, shaping both politics and culture, one small echo of which survives today in the chessboard, where bishops are powerful pieces. Still, nothing influenced Viking attitudes toward Christianity more than their encounters with the Byzantine Empire. From the 9th century onward, Swedish adventurers and the emerging Kievan Rus crossed swords with and eventually swore allegiance to Constantinople. To the Norse, the Byzantine capital was like another world. Its sheer wealth and grandeur were staggering. The city alone had more inhabitants than all of Sweden. It was also the first naval power capable of matching Viking strength. The Heimskringla captures thereon. When Harald Hardrada first entered the city, he famously told his companions to shut their gaping mouths, lest they look like fools. In the 10th century, Emperor Basilii, the Bulgar Slayer, established the Varangian Guard, an elite corps of 6,000 Viking warriors wielding massive axes. Though initially composed of Swedes and Rus, the Guards soon drew ambitious Norsemen from across the Viking world. Service under the Christian emperors promised immense prestige, glory, and wealth. Those who returned north brought back not only gold and stories of adventure, but also a new, broadened perspective on the Christian world. On the eve of the Viking Age, the Frankish Emperor Charlemagne had already set a brutal precedent by forcing the pagan Saxons of mainland Europe to accept baptism at sword point. Sacred groves were destroyed, and those who resisted were slaughtered. Yet the kings of Christendom rarely held enough power to treat the Vikings in the same fashion. Instead, baptism became a political tool. Victorious rulers demanded that defeated Viking leaders submit to the rite, as Alfred the Great did with the Danish warlord Guthrum and his jarls. One jarl, with typical Norse sarcasm, quipped that this was his 20th baptism, and scoffed at the poor quality of the white robe he was given. His joke reflected the general Viking attitude, more pragmatic than pious. For Alfred and other kings, the issue was never really salvation, it was peace. By tying Viking leaders to the church, however loosely, they created one more thread of obligation and legitimacy. It also helped silence critics among Christian nobles and bishops who questioned treaties with heathens. Guthrum himself proved the value of this tactic. Once baptized, he honored his truce, a surprising turn for a man once renowned for treachery. Likewise, Rollo accepted baptism to secure Normandy from Charles the Simple, and then skillfully used his new Christian identity to consolidate power. Ironically, it was not foreign kings, but the Vikings themselves who ultimately imposed Christianity on the Norse world. Beginning in the late 10th century, rulers like Harald Bluetooth Gormson, Olaf Tryggvason, Olaf Haraldsson, St. Olaf, and Magnus the Good wielded conversion as a tool of unification, often with fire and sword. In the East, Vladimir the Great of the Kievan Rus embraced Christianity as a foundation for empire, aligning his realm with the mighty centers of Rome and Constantinople. Even Iceland, distant and fiercely independent, bowed to the trend. In the year 1000, its parliament, the Althing, voted to adopt Christianity, not out of zeal, but as a pragmatic step to keep pace with the rest of the Norse world.